you're struggling to make some kind of change in your life, it's most likely because you're trying to make that change from the outside in. You're trying to force the change on yourself consciously. Maybe you're using willpower, discipline, or you're just trying to talk yourself into being different. And that almost never works, because lasting change doesn't happen that way. Lasting change is almost always created from the inside out. It's where we create a shift in how we perceive things, what we believe, the stories that we tell ourselves, the internal patterns that we've subconsciously learned that fire off automatically. All these things and more shape how you think, feel and behave. And when those things stay the same, it becomes incredibly difficult to create change that sticks. You might be able to fake it for a while, we've all tried that, but eventually you'll most likely slip back into familiar patterns. So in today's episode of the Inner Shift podcast, I want to dig into this idea in more depth and explore why, if we want to change in the long term, we need to address what's going on behind the scenes. Hey there and welcome to the Inner Shift podcast. My name is Stephen Burns and I've been a practicing therapist, coach and trainer for nearly 30 years. In each episode, I'll share tips, strategies and insights that you can put into practice straight away to create positive, lasting change in your life. We'll be discussing topics like NLP, mindfulness, positive psychology, hypnosis and the power of the subconscious mind. So if you have things that are standing in the way of your happiness and well-being, or if you're just invested in your own personal development, my friend, you are absolutely in the right place. So why is it that lasting change has to happen from the inside? Well, there are lots of reasons, but one of the main ones is because as a human being, we don't actually respond to reality. We respond to our inner perception of reality. So there's a concept in psychology called the map is not the territory. This is also used quite a lot in NLP, that's neuro-linguistic programming. And it's the idea that we don't respond to what is really going on. We respond to our inner map or our inner model that we've built up over the years. It's kind of like our own internal guides that we use to understand experience. So basically we take in everything through the 5 main senses. But if we were to be consciously aware of all of the millions of pieces of stimuli and data that's going on, then that would totally overwhelm us. So what our brain does is something pretty neat. It filters all of that information down into manageable chunks, into a manageable version. And this is what we refer to as our map or our model of the world. And that is what we are responding to on a moment-to-moment basis, not reality itself. We're responding to this watered-down, filtered-out version of what's actually going on. So it's a bit like if you were wandering around the streets of Glasgow. I'm going to assume that you live in Scotland, and you're using Google Maps to navigate the city. It could be any city for that matter. But the map that you're using, Google Maps, I know that they are super detailed these days, especially if you go down to the level of street maps. But the map is just an approximation. It's just a guide. And like I said, even though a map can be super detailed, it's not going to fully reflect what the city is like and what it has to offer. I mean, you could never fully represent Glasgow on a Saturday night at 2 a.m. when everyone's falling out of pubs, steaming drunk, going crazy mental. No map could ever possibly capture that. And that's probably a good thing too, if we're being honest. So it's the same with our own internal maps. What we perceive is not reality. And I know that sounds a wee bit sci-fi, a bit out there, but it is absolutely true. It's just our own approximation. And it's influenced by a number of different factors. Our past experiences, our beliefs, the stories that we tell ourselves, our values that we've built up and created throughout our lifetime, the things that we deep down believe are important, how we feel in the moment, our emotional state, our physical well-being. I'm sure you've had the experience where you've maybe had a hard weekend, you've been partying too hard. Maybe you were in that pub in Glasgow until 2 a.m. and you got to Monday morning and you feel so bad physically but also emotionally that you start thinking that the world is an evil, terrible place. And the thing is, the world is the same as it's always been. It just is. It hasn't really changed. But what has changed is your inner perception. And it's been influenced by your physical well-being and, of course, your emotional state. And I'm sure there's some more past experiences that have been triggered there as well. All of those things and more play a part in the construction of our map or our model of the world. So when you're looking to create change, you have to create change in your map because at the end of the day, that's all you've got. You don't behave according to reality, you behave according to your internal model of reality, how you perceive it to be true. So, to give you an example, there's an old classic self help book called Psycho-Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz. I think I read it when I was about 18 or 19 years old. It's pretty dated, but it's got some interesting ideas in there. So, basically, the book is about the importance of having a positive self image, how you perceive yourself from the inside. So, he was actually a plastic surgeon, and he found that when people got cosmetic surgery done, some of them would experience long term mental and emotional benefits. But many, in fact, most of them didn't. They just got a temporary release, but then once it wore off, they just felt pretty much the same and they often came back for more surgery. And of course, we've all seen examples of celebrities taking that to the extreme and it going horrifically wrong. But what Maltz deduced from this was that these individuals didn't actually have an external problem. They only believed that they had an external problem. Their issue was internal. It was to do with their self image, how they perceived themselves from the inside. And that was the thing that needed to change, not their physical experience. And this is the concept we're talking about here. When you're looking to create a change in your life, there's a tendency to always look outward, to try and change the world and the people in it. But that's almost always not where the problem is. The problem is to do with how you're perceiving things in your internal map. Now, there are some exceptions, of course. So, we're talking things like toxic relationships, personal or at work, or maybe your environment is dangerous or impoverished. You need to change those circumstances, of course. But even with those kind of situations, how you respond to them will be determined by what's going on for you on the inside. So you usually still always have to make some sort of internal shift. So that's the general concept, the general idea, but let's dig into this in a little bit more depth, shall we? So I mentioned a moment ago that there are several elements that affect our map of the world, that cause us to perceive things in a certain way. So the list was our past experiences, our beliefs, so the stories that we tell ourselves, our values, what we deep down believe are important, how we feel in the moment, our emotional state, and our physical well-being. And that list is, a bit of an unabridged one. There are more things that can be included there. But I want to focus on one of the things on that list, and that is the first one, and that is our past experiences. So the things that happened to you in the past, the baggage that you may still be holding on to, will affect how you perceive the world, how you think and feel today. And any problem that you experience will always have a history, it will have a past. And usually it's this baggage that holds the problem together that prevents you from moving on. So, to give you an example, say you are 10 years old, so it's a hypothetical example, and you're in the school playground, and the school bully decided to put a spider down the back of your neck. And you got so freaked out by it that your brain made a connection, and ever since then, you've been phobic of spiders. So this, by the way, is an example of one trial learning, and it's often how phobias are formed. You're going along fine, everything's okay, you haven't really thought about spiders or whatever the phobia is, and then you have one experience that is so negative intensely that your brain makes that powerful connection and overgeneralizes. So say that happened to you, and ever since then, every time you look at spiders in your flat or in your house, you suddenly freak out, you see them as, Satan's little helpers, rather than the boring creatures that they actually are. But say you never had that past experience. It never happened to you. So the school bully, you don't have any bullies in your school and no spider got put down your neck. Then you'll most likely acknowledge that spiders are pretty dull and spend most of the time doing nothing. In fact, spiders probably won't even be on your mind at all because you haven't made that connection, you haven't had that past experience. You know that they're not hatching intricate plans to infiltrate your safe space. But the difference here is the past experience. And this, of course, is why things like trauma can have such a long-term impact on people. It's why it can shape how they perceive the world and sometimes even shape aspects of a person's personality. But here's the thing, and I think this is the most important thing that I'll say in this episode. It's never what has happened to us in the past that defines who we are. It's the relationship we have with our past. In particular, the relationship we have with our past memories, the meaning that we've attached to them. So there's a really powerful technique. So I use this with clients. It's an NLP technique. It's something called timeline therapy. So it allows you to go back into your past in a safe way and reevaluate and release your associations with those past experiences. And it helps you release that baggage and let it go so you can finally move forward. And with this technique, the key thing is you're not changing the past. You can't change the past. We don't have a time machine. The past is over. None of us can ever experience the past again. But what you're doing with this technique is you're changing your relationship to it. You're changing the meaning that you attach to those past events that have been locked into your memory system. Because if you think about it, the past is just a collection of memories, movies and pictures inside your mind, thoughts about, what's happened to you that you're still holding on to. The past is really just a collection of memories that you've attached meaning to. And meaning is something that is entirely changeable. In fact, it's something that we change naturally as we get older. And I'm sure you'll have had an experience of this. Something bad happened to you, and at the time, it felt like the world had ended. It was like an apocalyptic event. But then a few months or even years went by, you matured a bit, and eventually you looked back and went, you know what? Maybe it wasn't such a big deal. Or maybe it was actually for the best. I know whenever I think of past romantic relationships that ended, it was a huge deal at the time. But then after a few weeks or a few months, I'm kind of like, well, actually, it wasn't meant to be. That was definitely for the best. And there's maybe other events that at the time were really big and really negative, but now you even look back and laugh. I think everyone has an example of that. It might even seem a little bit silly or comical. In fact, one of my friends, he's a stand-up comedian, he would write comedy scripts out of his past traumatic experiences, which is an interesting way to do therapy. But he said that it was one of the most therapeutic things that he's ever done because it allowed him to reprocess the past. And his relationship to those memories then changed. The experiences became resources because he could use them for material. And he also saw them through a different lens as well, and the meaning of them changed. It's like that phrase, someday you'll look back and laugh. I think, like I said, we've all had an experience of that. So we can't change the past because the past doesn't exist, right? Unless you've got a time machine. If you do, then drop me a message. I'd be quite keen on going on some time travel adventures. But we don't, that's just the stuff of sci-fi movies. But what we can do is we can change how we relate to the past. We can alter the meaning that we've attached to our past memories. And that is enough because at the end of the day, that is all we've got. The past doesn't exist. It only exists as a perception inside our mind. And this idea is so incredibly powerful. It means that you can go back and change how you feel about the past. What happened to you previously doesn't need to keep affecting you in the present moment. You can change how you relate to it. You can release those associations. And when we release those negative associations that are linked to our past, this can have a huge therapeutic effect on how we feel in the present. And as I mentioned earlier on, one way to do that is through something called timeline therapy. It's an incredibly powerful process. If you want more information on that, or if you would like to let go of something in the past, feel free to drop me a message and we can have a chat about it. But just remember, if you've had a difficult past, it doesn't mean that you still have to be affected by it. It is something that you can change. And when you do, this can be one of the biggest steps you can make towards long-term healing to make a more sustainable form of change. So, we've talked about a lot. Let's do a quick review. So, first of all, we talked about the idea that trying to change from the outside almost always doesn't work. Of course, sometimes we do have to change our external circumstances. For example, if you're in a toxic relationship, or if your environment is unsafe, or it promotes an unhealthy lifestyle, or it's not particularly supporting. So these things are obviously good to change. But even if you do find yourself in a situation like that, you will still have to do some inner work. It's important that you work on yourself to change how you're responding to those events. That's the thing that's going to give you the power to actually do something about it. That long-term change happens when you work on the inside. You make that inner shift. And the reason why that's so crucial is because we don't actually respond to reality. We respond to our inner perception of reality, our map of the world or our model of the world. So in order to change, we need to change our map. We need to expand it, tweak it. We need to create more choice. And then we had a look at the different factors that affect our map, that influence it. And we looked at one in particular, our past experiences. But the important distinction I made, and like I said, I think this is the most crucial thing that I've mentioned in this episode, is that the past doesn't define you. Your relationship to the past does, the meaning that you've attached to the past memories. And the great news is, that is changeable, and there are lots of ways to do that, and one way I mentioned is timeline therapy, but it is not the only way. So that is us for this episode of the Inner Shift podcast. If you've been affected by this in any way and you want to talk about it, then feel free to drop me an email at info@mindschool.net. Even if you've just got little bits of feedback, I'd love to hear what you think. Also, if you have ideas for future episodes, then once again, feel free to drop me an email. I'd love to hear what your ideas are. So that is us for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your week, and I'll speak to you in the next episode.